Hey guys, welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. Today's video, I'm going to talk about, or try to answer one of the most commonly asked questions that I've gotten over the years, and that question is, how much protein should I be ingesting, or how much protein should I be eating? And fortunately, we do have some pretty good data on that, both in sedentary individuals and in athletes. So that's kind of what I want to summarize for you guys today. And what I'm going to do is take a lot of this information from this position paper from the International Society of Sports Nutrition. This is one of their official consensus statements that they put out a few years ago, and it really nicely summarizes a lot of the research in this area, and gives you a good evidence-based answer for ways that you can set up your diet to make sure that you get adequate protein. Now the RDA, or the recommended daily allowance of protein, is thought to be somewhere around 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, divided up over however many meals that you like to eat during the day. Now, this is the bare subsistence level, and that's typically what RDA values reflect. So if you're just, an average sedentary, video game playing couch potato slug, 0.8 grams per kilogram is what the RDA recommends. Now, that amount of protein is woefully inadequate for any of you involved in any sort of athletic activity. And especially if you're a weight training athlete who's looking to either build as much muscle tissue as possible, or when you get older, to hold on to as much muscle tissue as possible, that 0.8 grams per kilo recommendation, woefully inadequate. You're going to need to take in quite a bit more, as we're going to discuss here in a second. So the ISSN recommends, based on this study, somewhere between 1.4 to 2.0 grams per kilo per day, divided over like 4+ meals, ideally. And that's the level that seems to be best for most athletes. Now, there's pretty good studies going back 2 decades showing that the more protein you eat, if you're a resistance training athlete, the more hypertrophy you're generally going to get, up to a certain point. And that certain point seems to be about 2.2 grams per kilo. So if you ingest protein, intake above that, you're not necessarily going to get much more in terms of muscle hypertrophy. Now, there are some studies that suggest that maybe that's not quite the case, that slightly higher levels could be more beneficial, particularly if let's say you're a hardcore bodybuilder, and you may be able to benefit from slightly higher amounts of protein. But as a general rule, 2.2 grams per kilo is kind of the upper limits, above which maybe you don't derive necessarily so much benefit. And that's actually the level that I recommend for most of my guys, with a few caveats. Now, the study that showed that 2.2 grams per kilo as being the upper limit, those studies were done in athletes who were either in a calorie surplus or at least on maintenance calories. They were not on guys who were dieting with a caloric deficit. So it turns out, if you're in a caloric deficit, you want to hold on to as much muscle tissue as you can when you diet. So if you're trying to cut body fat, the last thing you want to do is lose some of your hard-earned muscle mass along with that body fat. Now, sometimes a little bit of that is inevitable, but obviously you want to minimize that as much as you can. So this study here is another one that I'll mention briefly. It's called a systemic review of dietary protein during caloric restriction and resistance trained lean athletes. So these were not obese athletes, these were lean athletes, a case for higher intake. And the ISSN talks about this too, but it seems likely that a higher amount of protein is going to be beneficial if you want to hold on to muscle tissue, especially when you're dieting hard, whether it's anything from a bodybuilding competition or you're just trying to lose weight for your general health, and improve your body composition. So this article suggests somewhere between 2.7 and maybe up to 3.1 grams per kilo per day, divided out over, let's say, 4 to 5 meals. So quite a bit higher than the 2.2 that is is a general recommendation for most athletes. So just keep that in mind when you're dieting. If you're actively trying to cut body fat, and lose weight, you're gonna, and you know, obviously you want to hold on to your muscle tissue, you're gonna need to ingest a bit more protein. So, you know, instead of say 2.2, I would say just aim for 3 grams per kilo. And I think that's gonna be probably a reasonable thing to do. Now, a little caveat here, and they mentioned this specifically in the ISSN article, which I appreciate. They talk about leucine specifically. Now, leucine is a branched chain amino acid. It is probably the most important amino acid when it comes to stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So there's a direct correlation between how much leucine you have in your diet and your ability to build muscle tissue. And the ISSN recommends somewhere between 700 milligrams to 3 grams per meal, with 3 grams being their upper limit of normal. And again, this is in younger athletes, and by younger I mean like less than 60. Older athletes are going to need more. Okay, it's just the way it goes. In order to get the same amount of protein synthesis when you're 65, you're going to have to ingest more leucine than you would say when you're 25. It's just the way it goes as you get older. So what I do personally is I buy bulk leucine powder, and I take 15 grams of that and I put it in an enormous protein shake that I make every day, especially when I'm working at the hospital. And that protein shake I divide into 3 different meals. So I'm getting roughly 5 grams of leucine with each one of those shakes that I spread out, you know, during the course of my shift, which is usually about 9 to 10 hours. So when you mix it in a shake, you don't really notice it at that level, but leucine powder itself, if you try to mix it in water or juice, is god awful. It's like bitter, disgusting, nasty. So I don't recommend you do that. If you're going to mix it in something that either has a lot of flavor or something that has a lot of volume, so you can kind of dilute it out, because it's absolutely foul. So anyway, that's enough on leucine. It's really important. Whey protein is an excellent source of leucine. Obviously, animal protein sources have a lot of leucine in them as well. It's a little bit tougher to get from plant protein. I think hemp protein has the highest leucine content that I've seen, but even that, it's significantly less than what you find in whey or in beef. So if you're doing the vegan thing, just keep in mind you're going to have to source high leucine hemp protein and ingest a lot of it. And I'll tell you, that stuff's kind of disgusting too, even though I do use it in my shakes as well. So 2.2 grams per kilo, let's come back to that. That's going to be my general recommendation for most athletes under the age of 60, again, unless you're dieting. So what about over 60? This is an age management channel, right? So we want to be prepared when we get over the age of 60. And as I've talked about before, one of your primary goals in your younger years, again, is to put on as much muscle tissue as possible, ideally before the age of 50. And then as you get older, obviously you want to try to build muscle tissue if you can, but it's a lot tougher. So your primary goal is going to be to hold on to what you've built in your younger years. And again, in order to do that, you're going to need more protein than you did as a younger person. And you know, there is some pretty good data out there, but not much in terms of like bodybuilding, strength training athletes. Been able to find a few things, but as a general recommendation, I'm going to point you to this article here. This is from the journal Aging and Disease, the role of dietary protein and muscular fitness on longevity and aging. And remember I mentioned that 0.8 grams per kilo per day recommendation is like the general RDA. This article makes a strong argument for your average elderly person, again, over the age of 60, again, not weight training, not strength training, not even involved in endurance activity. They recommend going up from 0.8 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day for your average sedentary older person. So as you can imagine, you know, if you're a bodybuilder, a 65-year-old bodybuilder for say, or you know, someone who engages in really intense resistance exercise, which I think you should continue to do as you get older, you're going to need quite a bit more. I mean, they're almost doubling what the RDA says for a sedentary older person. So I usually recommend somewhere around 3 to 3.5 grams per kilo per day if you're over the age of 60. Now that recommendation is not as evidence-based as I would like, but I think it's reasonable based on the available amount of data. And it certainly is not going to cause any harm. So I can hear some of you out there, what about your kidneys? Well, so the protein kidney thing, that's a myth. It's been busted. So high intakes of protein do not cause kidney disease. Now, if you have established chronic kidney disease, if you've got nephropathy, nephrotic syndrome, something like that, there is some studies that show that a lower protein intake, a lower protein diet might help you preserve your kidney function. But I'll tell you that even that now is controversial. We were taught that in medical school, but there's emerging data that even that might be false. So, and I wouldn't be surprised if that also gets lumped into the myth bucket at some point in the future. But if you have healthy kidneys, within reason, you can handle a lot of extra protein and it doesn't cause any harm at all. There's also a myth that excess protein intake will leach calcium out of your bones. That's also a myth. You're not going to get osteoporosis by ingesting 3 grams per kilo per day of excess protein. So just let's put those to rest. I might do a separate video, kind of a protein myth busting video later, but I don't want you guys to worry about that. So that's all I have for you guys today. As a general recommendation, if you're a resistance training athlete under the age of 60, I want you to shoot for roughly 2.2 grams per kilo per day of good quality protein. Personally, I spread that out over 5 meals a day, and I think that's probably the best way to do it. Consider getting at least 3 grams of leucine as part of that with every single meal. If you want to go higher than that, I think that's fine. If you're over the age of 60, consider going above that 2.2. I would consider 2.2 as a minimum if you're a resistance training person who's considered elderly, which is roughly 60 to 65. Minimum is 2.2. I would recommend going higher than that, roughly at least around 3 grams per kilo per day. And again, that's not as evidence-based as I would like, but I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and I think would be to your benefit. So, and the same thing goes with leucine. I think, going above that 3 grams per day, if you're over the age of 60, 3 grams per meal, if you're over the age of 60, would also be a reasonable thing to do because, your ability to respond to protein ingestion with increased protein synthesis starts to go down as you get older. It just doesn't get any better. So it makes sense to me to increase that intake as well. So that's all I have for you guys today. So eat more protein if you're not already, okay? Don't go crazy with it, but just make sure that, especially as you get older, make sure you keep up with your protein. Again, your goal is to hold on to this. You worked hard for this muscle tissue. You want to hold on to it for as long as you can. All right, guys, take care. Feel free to leave me some comments. If you have questions, reach out. Always love to hear from you guys. Take care. And medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.